The neighborhood was supposed to be a sanctuary. That was the promise written between the lines of every glossy brochure the homeowners association distributed, the promise whispered by the neatly trimmed hedges and pristine sidewalks when new families moved in. When I bought the house, I believed in that promise, or at least I wanted to. After decades of wearing the badge, leading men and women through crime scenes, public protests, and the chaos of a city that never really slept, I longed for peace when I came home. That little cul-de-sac on the edge of town looked like it had been drawn by the careful hand of a painter. Red brick homes with white shutters, children pedaling their bikes in safe loops around the block, neighbors waving as they rolled their trash bins to the curb. It was the sort of place where people said nothing bad ever happened. But in my line of work, I knew better than to trust appearances. Evil and corruption don't wear neon signs. They show up in unexpected forms, sometimes wearing the mask of respectability, sometimes hiding behind rules written in fine print. In this case, they wore the face of the HOA. At first, the conflicts were small, nothing more than the sort of squabbles one expects when people live close together and a committee insists on governing every detail of daily life. A letter in my mailbox about the color of my shutters, apparently, slate blue, wasn't on the approved palette. A warning taped to my door about leaving my garbage cans out too long. Then there was the fine, $100 for parking my patrol SUV in the driveway overnight, even though I was on call and needed to leave at a moment's notice. They dressed it up in legalistic language, citing bylaws about vehicle uniformity and aesthetic harmony, but I knew what it really was, an attempt to flex their control. I tried to let it go, at least at first. After all, I had bigger battles to fight in the real world. But every time I thought the issue had settled, another notice appeared. The WA seemed to have developed a special fixation with me, as though my very presence in their tidy kingdom disrupted the illusion they worked so hard to maintain. Being the chief of police doesn't make you immune to frustration, but it does teach you patience. I've sat across from hardened criminals who swore up and down they were innocent even as their fingerprints stained the evidence bags on my desk. I've dealt with bureaucrats who thought delaying justice was just another tool in their kit. So when the WA president, a man named Harold Jennings, started appearing on my doorstep with a plastic smile and a clipboard, I didn't lose my temper. I listened, I nodded, I even agreed, once, to move the SUV into the garage despite the fact that it barely fit. But patience is a finite resource, and with each passing week, the association pushed me closer to the edge. The letters became increasingly hostile. The language sharpened. What had started as gentle reminders turned into final warnings. Then came the threats, thinly veiled at first, but unmistakable to a man who had spent his life decoding the language of power and intimidation. Failure to comply will result in escalated action. Continued disregard may leave us no choice but to pursue enforcement. I read those lines late at night under the glow of my desk lamp, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. These people, with their self-appointed authority and obsession with lawn height, were trying to intimidate the chief of police. Still, underneath the humor was a nagging awareness. People who rely on power without truly having it are often the most dangerous. They will bend rules, stretch lies, and invent authority where none exists. I'd seen gangs do it, I'd seen corrupt officials do it, and now I was seeing an HOA follow the same path. It wasn't just me they harassed, either. Neighbors whispered about fines that came without explanation, threats of foreclosure over trivial dues, even retaliatory measures when someone dared to question the board's decisions. An elderly couple down the street received a violation notice because their grandson left a basketball hoop in the driveway. Another family was told to take down the swing set in their backyard because it wasn't architecturally consistent. The WA operated less like a civic body and more like a petty regime, and Harold Jennings sat at the center of it all, relishing every ounce of authority he imagined he held. The difference was that most people lacked the will, or the means, to fight back. They paid the fines, lowered their heads, and told themselves it was easier to comply. That only emboldened the board, feeding their appetite for control. I knew eventually their attention would turn into obsession, and their obsession would spiral into something reckless. That's how it always works. Pressure builds until it finds a release valve. In the streets, that might mean violence. In a boardroom, it might mean corruption. In a suburban neighborhood, well, I was about to find out. One evening, after returning from a particularly long day at the precinct, I found an envelope slid under my front door. Unlike the others, this one wasn't printed on wall letterhead. No official logo, no typed paragraphs, just a single sheet of paper with blocky, uneven handwriting. The message was simple, almost laughably so: "You can't ignore us forever. Next time, we'll make sure you listen." That was the moment the line was crossed. Until then, the disputes had lived in the realm of rules and bylaws. Annoying, yes; petty, certainly, but still within the recognizable bounds of neighborhood politics. A handwritten threat slipped under my door was something different. That was personal. That was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. I folded the paper carefully, slid it into an evidence bag from my desk drawer, and placed it in a locked cabinet. Old habits die hard, and my instincts told me that whatever the WA had planned next, it wouldn't be another letter about shutter colors. I wish I could say I was surprised when my suspicions proved right, but the truth is, I wasn't. People like Harold Jennings always escalate. They can't help themselves. Authority, even false authority, is addictive. Once someone tastes it, they'll do anything to preserve it, and in their desperation, they'll take risks they never imagined themselves capable of. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was just how far they were willing to go, and just how ridiculous their plan would turn out to be. They thought they could scare me into submission. They thought they could dress up intimidation in uniforms and badges. They thought they could arrest me in my own neighborhood. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have planned for, was that the man they were targeting wasn't just another homeowner. He was the chief of police. And if they wanted a confrontation, I was more than ready to give them one. The knock came just after dusk, sharp and deliberate, the kind of knock that carried with it a sense of authority. Years on the force had trained me to read the small cues others overlooked, and that sound wasn't the careless rap of a neighbor borrowing sugar, nor the hesitant tap of a kid selling fundraiser cookies. It was firm, calculated, practiced, meant to be heard as official. I set down my coffee, instinctively straightening my posture as though preparing for an interview, and opened the door. On my porch stood two men dressed in dark uniforms, the kind you'd expect from law enforcement, though something about them didn't quite sit right. Their badges glinted under the porch light, but the metal looked too polished, too flat, lacking the weathered authenticity of the real thing. Each wore a black cap pulled low, and the younger of the two had a duty belt, so sparse it looked more like a Halloween costume accessory than actual police gear. "Good evening, sir," the older one said, his voice carrying the clipped rhythm of someone trying to sound official but overshooting into performance. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. You've been issued a warrant." He handed me a folded sheet of paper with a triumphant little smirk, like he expected me to gasp or recoil. Instead, I let the silence hang in the air as I unfolded it. The document was a mess. Words misspelled, no court header, no signature from a judge, just the HOA's name typed across the top in bold letters. At the bottom, a scrawled signature that looked suspiciously like Harold Jennings, though he'd clearly tried to disguise it with unnecessary flourishes. I let my eyes linger on the page before lifting them slowly to meet the impostor's gaze. His partner shifted uneasily, as though he already knew the act was falling apart. "You're here to serve a warrant," I repeated, my tone even, almost casual. "And this is supposed to be it." I waved the paper gently between two fingers. "Yes, sir," the older one pressed, though I caught the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Failure to comply will result in your immediate arrest." That word, arrest, landed with the subtlety of a brick. Not detain, not citation, not even appearance notice. Arrest. It was the kind of terminology someone uses when they've watched too many cop dramas and decided they could mimic the role without understanding the script. I decided to play along, at least for the moment. "Interesting," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Tell me, gentlemen, what agency are you with?" The younger one piped up too quickly. "Neighborhood Enforcement Division." The words came out in a rush, and he immediately glanced at his partner, as though searching for approval. The older man stiffened but didn't correct him. "Neighborhood Enforcement Division," I repeated, tasting the absurdity of it. I let the silence stretch again, my eyes drifting to their vehicle parked by the curb. It wasn't marked, not even with magnetic decals. Just a gray minivan, the kind soccer moms drive, only this one had mismatched hubcaps and a dent in the rear bumper. The thought of them pulling up in that and expecting to look intimidating almost made me laugh out loud. "All right," I said finally, lowering my voice to something firmer, more commanding. "Why don't you show me your credentials?" The older one reached for his badge, holding it up briefly before tucking it away again like a magician trying to distract from a botched trick. I caught the edges. No department seal, no serial number, not even the correct shape. A child with a 3D printer could have done better. The younger one didn't even bother pretending, he simply stood frozen, hands awkwardly at his sides. I said, letting my tone flatten. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to explain exactly why you're standing on my porch with fake badges and a forged warrant, and then maybe, just maybe, I'll consider not putting you in cuffs right now. The color drained from the younger man's face. The older one, however, doubled down, puffing his chest as though bluffing his way forward could salvage the situation. Sir, I advise you to cooperate. Non-compliance could escalate matters further. That was it, the final tell. Real officers never talk like that. We don't deal in vague threats, we specify charges, outline rights, state procedures. The more he spoke, the more he exposed himself. My training told me to de-escalate, but another part of me, the weary homeowner sick of WA games, wanted to push him, to let him unravel completely under the weight of his own performance. Escalate, I said softly, almost whispering, the way you do when you want someone to lean in and realize just how badly they've miscalculated. Gentlemen, do you have any idea whose door you've knocked on? The younger one blinked rapidly. The older one faltered for half a second, then steadied himself. We're here to enforce WA policy. Your position doesn't exempt you. That was when I smiled. Not broadly, not with humor, but with the kind of smile that says the game is over and the other side just hasn't realized it yet. You're absolutely right, I said. No one is above the law, which is why impersonating an officer, presenting a falsified warrant, and attempting an unlawful arrest are all felonies. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and lowered my voice another notch. And you just committed them on the chief of police. The silence that followed was delicious. The younger man's mouth fell open, then shut, then opened again without sound. The older one clenched his jaw, but the sweat beating along his hairline betrayed him. I could almost see the gears grinding in their heads, trying to calculate the fastest way out of a trap they'd walked into blind. I didn't give them the chance. With one hand, I reached into my pocket, not for my weapon, but for my phone. Here's what's going to happen, I said. I'm calling dispatch. You're going to stand right here until real officers arrive. If either of you even thinks about walking away, I'll make sure you don't get far. The older one's bravado cracked just enough for his partner to see it, and once the younger man realized their act was finished, panic spread like wildfire. His eyes darted to the minivan, his legs shifting as though preparing to bolt. But one sharp glance from me froze him again. Years of command presence aren't something you learn in a weekend, you earn it over a career, and in that moment, every ounce of it radiated from me. And yet, even as I dialed dispatch, even as the reality of their situation settled on them like a weight, a single question burned in my mind: who had sent them? These two weren't masterminds. They were pawns, desperate or foolish enough to put on fake uniforms and knock on a cop's door. Pawns don't invent schemes like this. Pawns get sent, which meant behind them, hidden in the shadows of this farce, the WA had decided to escalate its feud to a new and dangerous level. As I waited for dispatch to answer, I studied the imposters closely, noting every nervous twitch, every desperate glance. Whatever happened next, this confrontation was just the beginning. The WA thought they could scare me into submission. Instead, they had handed me the evidence I needed, and the perfect excuse to tear their little empire apart. The moment the call to dispatch connected, I gave the briefest report: 2 individuals impersonating law enforcement, attempting to serve a falsified warrant, location confirmed. My voice was steady, my words clipped with professional precision. Years of training had taught me to keep calm under pressure, and right now calmness wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. The imposters needed to see composure, not agitation. They needed to believe, even for a fleeting moment, that I was nothing more than a stubborn homeowner playing tough. The longer they underestimated me, the more rope they gave me to pull the mask off their charade. As soon as I ended the call, I tucked the phone back into my pocket and let the silence stretch. The older man shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes flicking toward the minivan parked at the curb, then back to me. He was calculating escape routes, debating whether to stand his ground or make a run for it. His partner, however, was already cracking under the weight of the performance. His jaw trembled, his eyes couldn't settle, and his breathing came shallow and uneven. I'd seen the look before, the look of a rookie criminal realizing that the game was over long before it had even begun. You boys came here with confidence, I said evenly, folding the so-called warrant in half and slipping it into my pocket. You knocked on my door, claimed to represent law enforcement, and threatened me with arrest. That takes guts. Or stupidity. Which one is it? The older man bristled, trying to puff himself up with another layer of false authority. We're acting under the authority of the association, he said, his voice strained. You've ignored repeated warnings. This is the consequence. Is that so? I asked, stepping closer, just enough to make him tilt his chin upward to maintain eye contact. Tell me then, what's your badge number? His lips parted, then closed again. He glanced at his partner, perhaps hoping he could supply an answer, but the younger man only stammered, 7. 7, I repeated, allowing the word to hang in the air with all the weight of ridicule. Just 7. No department prefix, no district code, no identification beyond a single-digit number. Remarkable. Must make roll call real simple down at your station. The younger one flushed red, his ears practically glowing under the porch light. The older man tried to recover, but I cut him off before he could conjure another weak excuse. Let's try another one. Which jurisdiction are you working out of? You've already given me a department name that doesn't exist. So, is it county, city, state? Who funds this? Neighborhood Enforcement Division. His jaw worked, but no words came. For the first time since they'd knocked on my door, his confidence faltered completely. I could see it in his eyes, the dawning realization that he had stepped into a battle he wasn't prepared for. You see, I continued, lowering my voice so it carried the weight of authority without rising in anger, real officers know their procedures. They know the chain of command. They know exactly what to say when someone questions their authority. Because authority isn't something you pretend to have. It's something you earn. And you too. I let my eyes sweep over their mismatched belts, their two shiny badges, their lack of radio equipment. You two don't have any. The younger man swallowed hard, a bead of sweat trailing down his temple. His partner opened his mouth, but I raised a hand, cutting him off once again. I'll save you the trouble. You don't need to explain yourselves. Not yet. What you need to understand is who you've tried to fool tonight. I took a deliberate step forward, closing the space between us until I could see the minute. Twitches in their expressions, the flicker of fear, the stubborn attempt to mask it. I held their gaze, letting the silence grow until it pressed down like a weight on both their shoulders. Then, in a voice calm and steady, I delivered the truth. You're standing on the porch of the chief of police. The younger man's reaction was immediate. His knees buckled slightly, his breath hitched audibly, and his eyes darted toward the street like a deer cornered on a highway. The older one froze, his face a mask struggling to hold together, but the crack was there, an involuntary tightening of the jaw, a twitch in the corner of his eye. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected fear, compliance, maybe even resistance, but not this. Not a revelation that their target wasn't just any homeowner but the head of the very department they were pretending to represent. You thought you could intimidate me, I went on, my voice never rising above a measured cadence. You thought a fake uniform, a falsified document, and a little bravado would be enough. But let me make something very clear, you've just committed a felony. You've impersonated officers, attempted unlawful detention, and threatened the chief of police on his own property. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're in? The younger one shook his head rapidly, as if denial could somehow undo the choices that had brought him here. The older one still clung to a shred of defiance, his lips curling as though he wanted to protest, but the words never came. He knew as well as I did that the game was up. For a brief moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the hum of a cicada in the distance and the faint rumble of a car passing 2 streets over. Then, slowly, I reached behind me, not for a weapon, but for the badge clipped to my belt. I held it up so the porch light caught the gold, the intricate engraving, the unmistakable seal of authority that couldn't be forged with a cheap printer and laminate. This, I said firmly, is what a real badge looks like. This is what real authority feels like. And this is what you'll be answering to when my officers arrive. The younger man whispered something under his breath, a string of half-formed apologies, but the older one stayed silent, his pride shackling him even as the reality of his situation crushed down. I didn't press him further, I didn't need to. The reveal had been made, the trap had been sprung, and all that remained was to let the weight of their mistake settle in. I stepped back slightly, giving them a sliver of space, not out of mercy but out of control. True authority doesn't need to shout, doesn't need to crowd. It simply stands firm and unshakable, and the world bends around it. And in that moment, on my porch beneath the pale glow of a suburban streetlight, they understood exactly what kind of authority they had chosen to challenge, and just how badly they had lost. The silence after my revelation stretched like a taut wire, every second thick with tension. The two imposters stood rigid on my porch, their eyes flicking from me to each other, then toward the street as though searching for some invisible lifeline that would pluck them from the snare they had walked into. I didn't rush them. Years of interrogations had taught me the power of silence. When you let it linger, it does half the work for you. People trapped in a lie will twist, squirm, and often unravel without you having to lift a finger. And here, with the weight of their deception now laid bare, I could see the unraveling begin. The younger one's hands fidgeted at his sides, clenching and unclenching as if his body couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. His chest rose and fell in rapid bursts, panic beating against his ribs. The older one, though still trying to project authority, was sweating freely under the porch light, a sheen glistening along his brow. His voice, when it finally emerged, betrayed the cracks in his armor. "Look," he started, his tone more defensive than commanding, we were told to come here, that's all. We were told you'd been ignoring the association, and that it was time for consequences." I cut him off with a raised hand. "You don't get to rewrite the script now. You showed up with fake badges and a fraudulent warrant. That's not an errand, that's a crime. And unless you're ready to give me a very good reason why I shouldn't have you in cuffs this very moment, I suggest you stand still and keep your mouths shut until backup arrives." That word, backup, hit them harder than anything else. The younger man's eyes widened, and the older one stiffened, his head jerking toward the sound of distant sirens drifting faintly through the neighborhood. They weren't for us, not yet, but the mere suggestion of oncoming patrol cars was enough to light a fuse under their nerves. The younger one shifted his weight toward the steps, the beginnings of retreat written across every line of his body. I took a single step forward, my voice sharp now, the command tone honed over years of policing. "Don't even think about it." He froze, his foot halfway lifted, the instinct to bolt colliding with the authority in my words. For a moment I thought he might actually break, might sprint for the van parked at the curb, but the sight of my badge still glinting in my hand stopped him cold. The older man, however, wasn't ready to surrender. He drew in a shaky breath, squared his shoulders, and tried one final desperate bluff. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice louder now, as though raising it could somehow patch the holes in his crumbling performance. "The association has rights. They can enforce their policies however they see fit. I stepped forward so quickly he flinched. "You're finished," I said, cutting him off with the precision of a blade. "HOAs don't get to send fake cops to arrest their residents. There is no universe in which your actions are lawful. You've crossed a line, and now you're going to answer for it." His mouth snapped shut, his jaw working silently as though chewing on words he couldn't bring himself to say. The younger one finally spoke, his voice breaking. "We didn't know. They didn't tell us you were." He stopped himself, eyes darting toward his partner, realizing too late that he'd said more than he intended. That slip was all I needed. My suspicions about the HOA's involvement had just been confirmed by their own loose tongue. I let the moment hang, let them both feel the full weight of what had just been admitted. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached for my radio. "Dispatch, this is Chief," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Status check on units en route to my location." "Copy, Chief," came the voice on the other end. "2 units 3 minutes out." The imposters heard it. I saw the panic bloom in their faces, a visible tide of realization that their window for escape was closing fast. The younger one's eyes darted wildly again, his body trembling on the edge of collapse. The older one's lips pressed into a thin line, his pride warring with his fear. Finally, the younger man broke. "I'm not going to jail for this," he cried, spinning toward the steps. But before he could take 2 strides, I barked his name, the name I had read off the flimsy warrant they'd tried to serve me. "Stop right there, Daniel." He froze mid-step, his body locking as though the sound of his own name spoken with such authority had anchored him in place. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned back toward me, his chest heaving. "How do you? I know more than you think," I said, my eyes narrowing. "And if you keep digging this hole, you'll be in it for the rest of your life." The older man grabbed his arm roughly, hissing something under his breath. It looked like a plea, maybe an order to hold steady, but it was too late. The facade had crumbled. Whatever illusion of control they thought they had was gone, shredded by their own incompetence and my refusal to be cowed. The distant wail of sirens grew louder now, unmistakably heading our way. Red and blue lights began to flicker at the end of the street, painting the night in stuttering flashes of authority. The impostors stiffened like statues caught in a spotlight. They knew what was coming. Their little performance, their borrowed authority, was about to be exposed not just to me but to every real officer who stepped onto this street. I turned slightly, angling my body toward the curb as the first patrol car swung around the corner, its lights washing over the scene. The impostors, faces drained of color, every ounce of their false confidence bleeding out under the reality of the situation. This, I said quietly, almost conversationally, is what real backup looks like. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, their uniforms crisp, their movements precise, their badges gleaming under the harsh glare of the headlights. Authority radiated from them effortlessly, the kind these two pretenders could never hope to counterfeit. As they approached, I lifted a hand in greeting. "Evening, Chief," one of them called, his tone respectful but curious. His eyes flicked to the impostors and widened slightly. "These the ones?" "They are," I confirmed. "Tried to serve me with a fake warrant, posed as officers. I want them in custody for impersonation, attempted unlawful detention, and whatever else we can tack on once we've had a closer look." The younger impostor broke completely then, sinking to his knees on my porch, his hands raised in a trembling surrender. The older one stood frozen, his pride the only thing keeping him upright, though his eyes darted desperately between the approaching officers and me. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing the ground beneath him was crumbling. "Hands where we can see them," one of the real officers barked, and both impostors complied, their bodies stiff with fear. The older man's defiance melted away as he slowly raised his arms, the last vestige of his counterfeit authority dissolving under the weight of reality. As the officers moved in to cuff them, I stood back, folding my arms across my chest. The neighborhood was quiet now, but I knew behind those drawn curtains, neighbors were watching, their eyes wide, their whispers already forming the story that would ripple through every household by morning. The WA had tried to send a message by sending these men. Instead, I had sent one of my own, a message written in flashing lights and cold steel handcuffs, and as the impostors were led down my steps toward the waiting patrol car, I knew the real confrontation was still to come. These men were pawns, disposable and foolish, but pawns always lead back to the hand that moved them. Harold Jennings and his precious association had just crossed into territory they couldn't walk back from, and I was more than ready to follow the trail they'd left straight to their door. The neighborhood returned to its fragile quiet after the patrol cars pulled away, but beneath the calm exterior I could feel the current of something darker stirring. The impostors were gone, hauled off in cuffs, but their presence lingered like a stain on the air. I knew better than to believe they'd acted on their own. No two amateurs wake up one morning, decide to forge badges, and march up to the home of a police chief unless someone pushed them toward it. Pawns never move without a hand guiding them, and I was certain I knew which hand it was. The problem was proving it. The WA had always hidden its intimidation behind the veil of policy and procedure. Fines, letters, threats scrawled with legal jargon, they thrived on making residents feel powerless. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of overzealous enforcement. This was a criminal conspiracy, and if they thought they could wash their hands of it, they had severely underestimated me. At the precinct the next morning, I sat with a cup of stale coffee and read through the preliminary reports on the two men. Their names were Daniel and Rick, both local, both with spotty work histories and financial troubles that could make them susceptible to coercion. Daniel, the younger one, had a record of petty theft and was currently behind on his rent. Rick, the older one, had filed for bankruptcy 2 years earlier and was barely keeping afloat. Neither had the resources or the organizational mind to dream up impersonating officers, let alone to print a mock warrant carrying the HOA's name. They were hired muscle, cheap, desperate, and disposable. That much was obvious, but who hired them? The answer, of course, was practically written in bold letters across the falsified warrant itself. The HOA's name was printed right at the top, as though Jennings and his board couldn't resist stamping their authority even on something so blatantly illegal. It was a sloppy move, the kind arrogance always produces, and it gave me exactly the thread I needed to start pulling. I forwarded the document to our forensics team, asked them to trace the paper, the ink, the printer, anything that could tie it back to a location. In the meantime, I paid Harold Jennings a visit. His house sat at the far end of the cul-de-sac, larger than most, its lawn trimmed to a precision that screamed obsession. A late-model luxury SUV gleamed in the driveway. I knew before I even knocked that Jennings would greet me with his usual veneer of false civility, and he didn't disappoint. He opened the door in a pressed polo and khakis, his hair slicked back, his smile tight but practiced. "Chief," he said smoothly, as though my presence was a social call rather than an interrogation. "What a surprise, Harold," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Mind if I come in?" He hesitated, just long enough for the truth to flash across his eyes, before stepping aside. His house smelled faintly of lemon polish and something chemical beneath it, the kind of sterile perfection that spoke more of image than comfort. We sat in his living room, and I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You know why I'm here," I said. His smile faltered but didn't disappear. "I can't imagine. 2 men showed up at my door last night," I continued, watching his reaction carefully. "They claimed to be law enforcement. They carried badges, uniforms, and a warrant with the HOA's name across the top. That ring any bells?" For the first time, the mask cracked. His eyes flicked away, just for a second, then snapped back. "That's absurd," he said quickly. "The association would never sanction something like that. We operate strictly within the bylaws." I leaned forward slightly. "Harold, let's not play games. You've been sending me letters for months. You've threatened escalation. Now suddenly 2 hired thugs show up with a fake warrant citing the association. That's not coincidence. That's a chain of events." He straightened in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "If someone misused our name, that's hardly the fault of the board. Perhaps these men acted on their own." "Except one of them admitted otherwise," I countered. "He said they were told to come. Told to enforce consequences. And I'll bet if I look hard enough, I'll find the trail of money that led them straight to my porch." The silence that followed was telling. Jennings' face remained stiff, but the pulse visible at his neck betrayed his unease. Finally, he leaned back, forcing a laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Chief, you're blowing this out of proportion. Let's be reasonable. Maybe we can resolve this quietly, without making it a public spectacle." There it was, the pivot from denial to negotiation, the desperate attempt to keep the dirty laundry from airing outside the pristine walls of his little empire. I stood, towering over him, and let my words cut through the facade. "You crossed the line, Harold. This isn't about lawn ordinances or garbage cans. This is impersonation, conspiracy, intimidation. You put my neighbors at risk. You put me at risk. And you thought you'd get away with it because you hide behind an HOA charter. But let me be perfectly clear, your charter doesn't put you above the law. It puts you directly under it." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I left him sitting in that immaculate living room, the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. Because whether he admitted it or not, the noose was already tightening. Back at the precinct later that day, the forensic team confirmed what I had suspected. The warrant had been printed on a commercial machine leased to none other than the WA office. The signatures and handwriting matched Jennings' prior correspondence almost perfectly. The evidence was damning, and with the confession already extracted from one of the imposters during questioning, the case was solidifying fast. As the investigation deepened, more details surfaced. Jennings had used WA funds, residents' own dues, to pay Rick and Daniel for their services. He'd pitched it to the board as a special compliance project, dressing it up with vague language that none of them questioned closely. Those who did raise an eyebrow were silenced with promises that it was simply a matter of restoring order to the neighborhood. What they didn't realize was that their signatures on the expense reports now tied them to the conspiracy as well. The scale of it left even me momentarily stunned. In WA, an organization supposedly dedicated to keeping grass trimmed and property values stable, had transformed itself into a petty regime willing to hire impersonators to strong-arm residents. It was absurd, almost laughable, but also deeply dangerous. If they had chosen someone other than me, someone without the training, without the authority, without the ability to see through their performance, the outcome could have been very different. A frightened homeowner might have complied, might have handed over money, or worse, followed these men into a van under the belief they were being legally detained. The thought sickened me. As the pieces fell into place, I prepared the case file with the same diligence I would any criminal investigation. Photos of the falsified warrant, copies of the forged badges, financial records showing WA payments to Rick and Daniel, forensic analysis linking the documents to the WA office printer, all of it formed a neat, damning package. By the time I was done, there was no room for denial, no path for Jennings to wriggle free. The HOA's dirty secret was no longer confined to whispered rumors and late-night threats. It was laid bare in black and white, waiting to be presented in a courtroom. And as I looked at the evidence spread across my desk, I knew one thing for certain. Jennings had played his last card. The HOA had tried to silence me with intimidation, but in doing so, they had handed me the very tools I needed to dismantle their corrupt little kingdom. What came next would not just be justice for me. It would be justice for every neighbor who had ever been bullied, fined, or threatened by the association's heavy hand. The HOA had built its authority on fear. Now, fear would no longer serve them. The wheels of justice don't always move quickly, but when they finally start to turn, they grind down everything in their path. By the time the case against Harold Jennings and his HOA board reached its conclusion, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Whispers spread faster than wildfire, how the association had tried to intimidate me with fake officers, how their grand scheme had unraveled in the most humiliating way possible, how the police chief himself had turned the tables on them. For weeks, the community buzzed with stories, each retelling a little more dramatic than the last. Some swore the imposters had come armed. Others said I had drawn my weapon on them, though I never had. Rumors, like weeds, thrive in fertile soil, and Jennings had cultivated plenty of it. But beneath the exaggerations lay one immutable truth: the HOA's stranglehold on the neighborhood was broken. Rick and Daniel, the two imposters, were the first dominoes to fall. In court, they looked nothing like the men who had stood on my porch trying to puff themselves up with counterfeit authority. Their uniforms were gone, replaced by ill-fitting county jumpsuits. Their bravado had evaporated, replaced by downcast eyes and trembling voices as they pled guilty to impersonating law enforcement. The judge showed little mercy, handing them both sentences that included jail time and hefty fines. For men already teetering on financial ruin, the punishment was devastating, but it was also necessary. Their cooperation during the investigation earned them reduced charges, but their testimony cemented the case against Jennings. They admitted openly that they had been hired, that the plan had been crafted not by them but by the HOA itself, and that Jennings had insisted this enforcement action was necessary to restore discipline to the neighborhood. Their words, delivered under oath, struck like hammers. The trial of Jennings and the board was a spectacle. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA's letters and fines packed the gallery, their faces lit with a mix of vindication and curiosity. The board members sat in a row behind their lawyers, their expensive suits doing little to disguise the discomfort etched into their features. Jennings, still clinging to the arrogance that had defined him, tried to maintain the air of a man wrongly accused, but the evidence shredded his composure. When the forged warrant was displayed on the courtroom screen, his signature circled in red, there were audible gasps from the audience. When the forensic expert explained that the printer used belonged to the HOA office, Jennings shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. And when Rick and Daniel testified, describing how Jennings had personally instructed them to make an example out of me, the color drained from his face. The defense tried every tactic in the book. They claimed Jennings had been misunderstood, that the imposters had acted independently, that no one on the board had truly authorized the plan. But the paper trail told a different story. Expense reports showed HOA funds being funneled into vague compliance activities. Emails revealed Jennings' growing frustration with my supposed insubordination. One particularly damning message outlined the need to demonstrate authority decisively against me. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed an unmistakable picture of corruption, abuse of power, and reckless endangerment. When the verdict was finally read, the room seemed to exhale as one. Guilty, on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit impersonation, misuse of HOA funds, and harassment. Jennings' shoulders slumped as though the weight of the word itself had crushed him. The other board members, though given lighter sentences, were still convicted of negligence and complicity. The judge's ruling dissolved the board effective immediately and placed the HOA under the supervision of a court-appointed administrator until a new, law-abiding leadership could be elected. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free from the tyranny of Jennings' rule. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt no joy in the victory, only a steady, quiet satisfaction. Justice isn't about gloating, it's about restoring balance, about reminding people that no one, not even a suburban dictator in a pressed polo, stands above the law. Still, I couldn't help but notice the shift in the air around me. Neighbors I barely knew nodded at me with respect. A few stopped to thank me. An elderly woman who had once been fined for having her granddaughter's swing set in the yard actually hugged me, tears in her eyes. For them, this wasn't just my victory, it was theirs too. It was proof that the intimidation they had endured had finally come to an end. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. The constant stream of violation notices disappeared. The heavy-handed enforcement of trivial rules stopped. People planted flowers in colors not found on the HOA's approved palette. A child's basketball hoop returned to a driveway without consequence. The cul-de-sac, once tense with fear of letters and fines, began to feel alive again. Children's laughter filled the air, barbecues returned to backyards, and neighbors actually gathered to talk without worrying who might report them. It was as though a shadow had been lifted, and the light revealed a community eager to breathe freely again. For me, the ordeal served as a stark reminder of a truth I'd carried with me my entire career: unchecked power, no matter how small its stage, is dangerous. Jennings and his board weren't drug lords or mob bosses, but their methods weren't so different. They relied on intimidation, on the silence of those too afraid to resist, on the illusion of authority propped up by fear. Strip away the suburban setting, and the parallels to larger corruption were undeniable. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all, that tyranny doesn't always wear the face of a dictator on a balcony. Sometimes it wears khakis and runs a neighborhood association. The imposters will serve their time. Jennings will likely never recover from the disgrace, his reputation in tatters, his name forever linked to the scandal. The HOA itself, once a symbol of oppression, now stood as a cautionary tale. And the neighbors, ordinary people who had once bowed their heads and paid fines without question, walked a little taller. They'd seen what happens when one man stands up, when truth is dragged into the light, and they learned that fear loses its power the moment it's confronted. As for me, I returned to my routine, though routine always takes on a new meaning after something like this. Every time I drove into the neighborhood, past the hedges and freshly painted shutters, I was reminded that peace is not something you're given, it's something you defend. Whether on the streets of the city or in the quiet lanes of a suburban cul-de-sac, justice demands vigilance. And so, when I parked my SUV in the driveway one evening, the same vehicle Jennings had once fined me for, I left it there proudly. No letters appeared, no warnings were taped to my door. The silence of the night was genuine, not manufactured by fear, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood truly felt like home. The HOA had tried to turn intimidation into law, to bend fear into obedience. In the end, they'd discovered what countless others before them had learned: you can dress corruption in a uniform, you can hide it behind fine print, but eventually the truth will drag it into the light, and when it does, justice will serve itself, whether on the steps of a courthouse or on the porch of a quiet suburban home.